لو أخذنا ارتفاع جبل إيفرست، سيظل أمامنا حوالي ميل من الماء قبل أن نصل إلى سطح المحيط. بذلنا الكثير من الوقت والجهد في تطوير تقنية صيد الغواصات. 7 أميال تحت سطح الأرض.
7 miles beneath the surface of the Pacific, in a place so far down that sunlight has not touched it in longer than humans have existed, a camera flickered on inside total darkness. For a moment there was nothing but drifting sediment caught in the beam, the slow snow of particles that never stops falling in the deep sea. Then something moved into the light. It was small, pale, almost see-through, and it should not have been able to exist where it was. The pressure at that depth is enough to fold steel like paper, and yet the creature drifted through it, as if it were swimming in a garden pond. When the footage made its way back to the surface, it did not just surprise the scientists watching it. It forced them to question decades of settled belief about what life can and cannot survive. To understand why a single soft-bodied fish could shake an entire field of science, you first have to understand where it was found. The Mariana Trench sits in the western Pacific, a scar in the ocean floor created where one tectonic plate is slowly forced beneath another. At its deepest, a spot called the Challenger Deep, the seafloor drops to nearly 36,000 feet below the surface. To put that number into something the mind can actually hold, imagine taking Mount Everest, the tallest point on land, and lowering it into that trench. The summit would still sit almost a mile underwater before you ever broke the surface. That is not a close comparison. It is not even in the same category of depth. It is a different world stacked on top of our own. Down there, the water pressure exceeds 1,000 atmospheres, which means every square inch of anything sitting on that seafloor is enduring a force equivalent to several loaded cement trucks balanced on a coin. The temperature hovers just above freezing, and the darkness is not the ordinary darkness of a moonless night. Sunlight stops penetrating seawater at around 3,000 feet. The Challenger Deep is more than 10 times deeper than that boundary. It has been that way for longer than there have been eyes on Earth to notice the difference. No light has ever reached that seafloor. Not once. Not ever. Scientists gave this layer of ocean a fitting name, the Hadal Zone, borrowed from Hades, the ancient underworld. It was named for the dead before anyone had properly looked to see if it actually was. For most of the 19th and 20th centuries, that assumption held firm. When researchers first began dragging sampling equipment along the deep seafloor in the 1800s, their nets came back nearly empty. A little mud, some cold sediment, nothing that looked like it belonged to a thriving ecosystem. Each empty hull reinforced the same conclusion. The deep ocean was a barren desert, hostile to anything more complex than bacteria. In 1960, 2 men, Jacques Picard and Don Walsh, rowed a bathyscaphe called a Trias down to the very bottom of the Challenger Deep, becoming the first humans to reach it. They reported seeing what looked like a flatfish resting on the seafloor. But their equipment was primitive, the visibility was poor, and the claim could never be properly verified. For decades afterward, the scientific consensus barely moved. The deep trenches were treated as effectively lifeless, a footnote rather than a frontier. The picture only began to change once technology caught up to curiosity. Starting in the 1970s, remotely operated vehicles and pressure-rated submersibles allowed scientists to send cameras and sensors into places no human body could safely follow. In 1977, researchers exploring deep ocean ridges found something that upended assumptions about where life could exist at all. Hydrothermal vents, cracks in the seafloor pouring out mineral-rich water heated by the planet's interior. Clustered around those vents were entire communities of organisms, thriving without a single photon of sunlight to power them. The explanation turned out to be chemosynthesis, a process by which certain bacteria build usable energy directly from chemical reactions rather than from light. It was a genuine rewriting of biological rules. But even that discovery happened at depths far shallower than the true Hadal Zone. The deepest trenches on the planet remained essentially unexplored, hidden behind pressures that most equipment simply could not survive. That began to change in 2019, when explorer and former naval officer Victor Vescovo launched an ambitious undertaking called a 5 Deeps Expedition, aiming to reach the lowest point of every ocean on Earth. The final and most punishing target was a Challenger Deep itself. Vescovo's vehicle, a submersible called a Limiting Factor, had been engineered from the ground up to withstand the crushing environment of the Hadal Zone, and it carried something no previous expedition to that depth had: a high-resolution camera system capable of capturing clear, detailed footage in total blackness. Each dive meant roughly 4 hours of descent through increasingly black water, hours spent on the seafloor gathering data, and another 4 hours climbing back toward the surface, all inside a sealed titanium sphere with no possibility of rescue if anything went wrong. It was, by any definition, one of the most extreme working environments a person could choose to enter voluntarily. Watching the footage arrive in real time aboard the support ship was Alan Jameson, a deep-sea biologist who had spent much of his career studying the Hadal Zone specifically, often while defending the idea that it was worth studying at all. Jameson had built a career on the assumption, grounded in the best available evidence, that anything living at those depths would be scarce, scattered, and barely getting by. What came back on the monitors did not match that picture. Instead of an empty seafloor with the occasional lonely organism, the frame filled almost immediately with movement. The first responders were amphipods, small crustaceans related to shrimp, and they did not arrive as isolated individuals. They arrived in swarms so dense that under the camera lights they looked less like separate animals and more like a single living cloud, churning and colliding as they converged on bait left by the expedition. For scientists who had spent years defending the idea that the trench held any meaningful biomass at all, the sight of that much life crowding a single frame was staggering. It was not a trickle of survivors. It was an ecosystem functioning at full capacity, in a place theory said should barely support anything. As the cameras continued rolling, more of the seafloor's residents came into view. Sea cucumbers moved unhurried across the mud, grazing exactly the way their shallow water relatives do, with no visible sign of strain. Small worms and isopod-like creatures appeared in shapes and behaviors that had rarely, if ever, been documented at that depth. None of them were isolated. They interacted, competed, scavenged, and hunted in patterns that suggested a functioning food web rather than a collection of desperate stragglers. That distinction mattered enormously. A loose scattering of tough survivors is one thing. An organized web of scavengers, filter feeders, and predators, each occupying a distinct niche, is something else entirely. Food webs like that do not appear overnight. They take long stretches of time, generation after generation, to settle into place. What the cameras had captured was not a fluke. It was evidence of a stable, long-established community that had simply never been observed before. Perhaps the most unsettling detail was not what these animals were doing, but how they were doing it. Biological logic suggested that anything living in a cold, food-scarce, crushingly pressurized environment should move slowly and conserve energy at every opportunity. Instead, the amphipods swarmed bait aggressively, competing with each other in a way that looked less like desperation and more like confidence. Fish moving through the same frame swam smoothly and with full control, the way a fish would move through a warm, shallow bay, not the way an organism barely holding on would move. The trench, it turned out, was not simply tolerated by the creatures living in it. For them, it was ordinary. Home. The mechanism behind that resilience turns out to be quieter than most people expect. These organisms are not built from some exotic alien biology unrelated to our own. Their bodies are mostly water, and water resists compression far better than air-filled structures do, which means the pressure inside their tissue stays close to equilibrium with the pressure pressing in from outside. At the cellular level, their proteins are shaped to hold their structure under conditions that would deform ours, and their cell membranes are built from fats that stay flexible instead of stiffening in the cold. It is the same basic biological toolkit every living thing on Earth uses, adjusted in a handful of precise, hard-won ways. Life did not need to reinvent itself to survive the Hadal Zone. It only needed to bend, and it turns out biology can bend much further than anyone had given it credit for. And then there was the animal that gave this whole discovery its name in headlines and documentaries alike: the Hadal snailfish. Roughly 8 to 10 inches long, pale, faintly translucent, almost soft enough to look unfinished. It drifted to the camera's light with none of the armor or bulk one might expect from something built to survive the deepest recorded point on the planet. By every assumption that had guided deep-sea biology for a century, an animal at that depth should have needed to be tough, dense, reinforced. Instead, the deepest fish ever filmed looked delicate enough to fall apart in a person's hands. And yet there it was, fully intact, gliding calmly through pressure that would instantly destroy an unprotected human body. That contrast, a fragile-looking creature thriving where nothing should be able to, is what sent researchers back to their notes to recheck assumptions they had treated as settled fact. Even after cataloging the abundance, the diversity, and the surprising vigor of life at the bottom of the trench, one major question remained stubbornly unanswered. What was feeding all of it? No sunlight reaches at depth, so nothing there can photosynthesize. The traditional explanation has always been marine snow, the slow rain of organic debris drifting down from the sunlit layers far above, sometimes taking days to complete its descent. But when researchers ran the numbers, the amount of marine snow reaching the trench floor did not come close to explaining the density of life the cameras had documented. Chemosynthesis, the process discovered near hydrothermal vents, offers a partial answer, but hydrothermal activity has not been confirmed throughout the entire trench, so it cannot account for everything either. It is possible that hadal ecosystems simply recycle available nutrients with extraordinary efficiency, wasting almost nothing, sustaining more biomass on less available energy than scientists thought was biologically possible. It is also possible there are energy sources or ecological relationships in that environment that have not been identified at all. Either way, the honest answer researchers have settled on is that they do not fully know, and that gap, an entire functioning ecosystem whose energy budget cannot be completely explained, is itself remarkable. There is one more discovery from these expeditions that lands very differently from the rest, and it has nothing to do with biology at first glance. When Vescovo's submersible reached the floor of the Challenger Deep, the cameras did not only capture crustaceans and translucent fish in the sediment nearby. The lights also picked out a plastic bag and what appeared to be food packaging, resting on the seafloor of the most remote, least accessible place on the planet. Human waste had reached the deepest point on Earth before a piloted vehicle ever did. Later analysis of amphipods collected from hadal trenches found microplastic particles inside their tissue, meaning pollution generated on the surface had not only sunk to the bottom of the ocean, it already worked its way into the bodies of animals living there, animal science had barely begun to identify or understand. The most isolated ecosystem known to exist on this planet was already carrying a trace of human presence inside it before we had even confirmed, in a way that could withstand scientific scrutiny, that the ecosystem was there at all. Step back and look at everything these dives actually established, and the shift in understanding is larger than a single fish or a single expedition. For the better part of 2 centuries, the deep ocean trenches were treated as essentially dead space, a footnote below the more interesting, more accessible layers of sea. That assumption was not lazy. It was built on the best evidence available at the time, from empty sampling nets to the physical limits of early technology. But it was still wrong, and it took modern engineering, a willingness to descend into one of the most hostile environments on Earth, and a scientist patient enough to compare new footage against old assumptions to prove it. What emerged was not a monster and not a single sensational animal, but a functioning, organized, energetic community of life, thriving in conditions that had been treated as a hard boundary for what biology could tolerate. The footage from the Challenger Deep covers only a handful of small, illuminated patches within a trench that stretches for well over 1,000 miles along the seafloor. Almost all of that terrain remains completely unfilmed and unexplored. If life is abundant and this resilient exists in the tiny fraction we have managed to observe, it raises an honest, unresolved question about everything still sitting beyond the reach of our lights. Science does not currently have proof of anything larger or stranger lurking just past the edge of those camera beams, and it would be dishonest to claim otherwise. What has changed is simpler and, in its own way, more significant. The automatic dismissal is gone. For generations, anything unusual reported from the deep sea could be waved away with the confident assumption that nothing complex lived down there to produce it. That assumption no longer holds. The trench turned out to be alive, organized, and stranger than the textbooks allowed. And the only reason we know that now is because someone was finally willing to look closely enough and honestly enough to admit the old picture was wrong.